Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to present my second thematic report to you addressing Indigenous peoples and international solidarity, as well as my two country visit reports on Suriname and Denmark and Greenland. I wish to warmly thank the missions of Canada, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, India, and España for sending input to my thematic report. I also greatly appreciate the valuable input sent by civil society groups and academics. So the world is facing increased polarization, fragmentation, and violence. And the majority of violence and armed conflicts and militarization of territories include areas in which indigenous peoples live, from the Arctic to the Amazon rainforest. And there is an absolute urgency to facilitate their participation for the articulation of peaceful dispute resolution instead of excluding them from negotiations. Now, in the spirit of celebrating the 20th anniversary of my mandate, I call upon this Human Rights Council to recognize international solidarity as the foundation of a 21st century multilateralism based on networks between states and civil society groups and corporations and faith institutions and academics and indigenous peoples to address the global challenges in the pursuit of peace and sustainable development. And I especially welcome all of the women in this council to lead the way in seeking to cross bridges between the regional groups in pursuit of peace. Now, international solidarity may be considered as the positive corollary to non-discrimination and equality, as it calls for inclusion of all in the enjoyment of human rights. An example of indigenous solidarity is one which envisions unity within multiculturalism through the creation, and I quote, of the kind of society in which we could trust each other enough to place our lives in each other's hands by linking arms together and eating together out of the same bowl. So indigenous peoples are important international solidarity leaders. They show respect for the environment, and they extend solidarity support to other groups in situations of vulnerability, such as migrants and minorities. The construction of a global indigenous people solidarity movement could prove to be a counter to the trend towards multipolarity, as indigenous peoples could show leadership in emphasizing the urgency of peaceful resolution of conflicts, of mutual respect among all peoples, and protection of those most vulnerable, as well as confirming the primacy of safeguarding Mother Earth in unity according to the indigenous worldview. Now, one of the foremost threats to indigenous solidarity is the conflation of the term local communities with indigenous peoples. Another threat is the selected legal recognition of indigenous peoples by governments that favor certain tribes over others. And this results in the denial of legal rights and discriminatory access to government services. That includes limitations on rights to access to natural resources. So indigenous solidarity is made worse by the negative impact of extractive industry actors that engage in practices that damage the environment and affect indigenous peoples living near mining sites, such as dumping toxic substances into rivers or creating excessive noise, such as blasting. And this is done without effective remedies. So indigenous solidarity, what it is it's a requirement of participation in governments. And we have really good examples. For example, Argentina and Nigeria have national forums for indigenous peoples, while Denmark and Fiji and New Zealand and Singapore and Zimbabwe also have parliamentary seats for indigenous peoples. Now, solidarity actions by indigenous communities have involved communication by social media. However, Indigenous peoples engaged in solidarity actions have been subject to legislation related to anti-terrorism, to counterinsurgency policies, and this includes surveillance or limitation of access to communication technologies. We see that Indigenous peoples engaged in solidarity actions are silenced by government bodies and targeted by security forces and vigilante groups, and this results in arbitrary arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings. And similarly, we've seen a marked escalation of assassinations of Indigenous defenders who've led solidarity protests against illegal mining and drug trafficking within their territories. It is of concern that some corporations have used gender-based violence as a tactic to seize land or to quell community resistance to industrial megaprojects, and those who resist exploitation of their resources by the extractive industries or refuse to leave their territories are displaced, they're criminalized, or they're forcibly disappeared or even killed. So Article 6.3 of the revised draft Declaration on Human Rights and International Solidarity contains an implicit due diligence standard that whereby corporations have the duty to create effective mechanisms for the presentation of solidarity demands by Indigenous peoples. And it's notable that Canada has a resource co-management board to conduct environmental assessments of land use planning and project approvals. And this is composed of Indigenous members who make recommendations to federal and territorial ministers on major projects. And these may include public hearings in multiple Indigenous languages and lead to community-based monitoring programs or oversight boards. There are also Indigenous environmental solidarity networks, such as the Eastern Himalayan Network on Climate Change. And these networks join Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and they cooperate to address landslides, droughts, floods, and biodiversity loss. And they also tackle violence against women, displacement, and land grabbing. And they issue joint declarations and statements. Another best solidarity practice we see from the government of Costa Rica that described how the Red Plus program enabled a national consultation of the Indigenous peoples to set up environmental projects. We see that Indigenous peoples and minorities often share similar concerns regarding racism, stereotyping, hate speech, discrimination, marginalization, and exclusion. So the report discusses Indigenous solidarity with minority groups. However, some Indigenous peoples in Africa express concern that states allowed refugees and internally displaced persons to reside in the territories belonging to Indigenous peoples, resulting in tension. Now, examples of solidarity acts of resistance include Australian Aboriginal passport ceremonies in which 200 immigrants received Aboriginal passports after signing a pledge recognizing the sovereignty of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And this provided sanctuary to asylum seekers while recognizing Aboriginal self-determination. Another example is the Canadian No One Is Illegal group that protests against tourism, mining, and real estate development on Indigenous lands and calls for accountability for the murder of Indigenous women and for the reclamation of land. In the US, we saw Indigenous and tribal leaders criticizing the government's practice of separating immigrant children from their families, and they called it a reincarnation of the practice of forcibly sending Indigenous children to boarding schools. So the increase in political violence and armed conflict and the militarization of our societies has resulted in a real risk of forced migration among Indigenous peoples in both the global north and the south. Indigenous peoples are also at risk of forced conscription and detention after migration, and this is due to their citizenship rather than their ethnic identity. And for example, we see Indigenous people from Ukraine and Sami who are in detention in Nordic countries after crossing borders on account of the war in Ukraine. Now, Canada, Honduras, Costa Rica, and España described how solidarity funding is facilitated to enable Indigenous participation in international forums. And we see several Indigenous women's associations that engage in solidarity with the feminist forums. Here you'll see cooperation with Black women, Muslim women, and women with disabilities. And we also see good solidarity practices coming from India and Guatemala in offering solidarity for Indigenous students to pursue education. So the report calls on states to show solidarity by recognizing Indigenous peoples' territorial rights and refrain from conflating local communities with Indigenous people, as well as upholding the right to free, prior, and informed consent on any decision affecting them. And moreover, it calls for raising funds to facilitate international solidarity exchanges between the Indigenous peoples of the global North and the South and the East and the West, and supporting Indigenous education. So I now turn to my country visit reports, and in this regard, I'd like to warmly thank the governments of Denmark and Greenland and Suriname for the invitations to visit their countries and the excellent cooperation extended to me throughout the visits. My country visit to Suriname in January 2025 was enlightening, as the society may be regarded as the very embodiment of solidarity through the peaceful coexistence of its diverse population, which includes intermarriages between East Indians, Creoles, Javanese, Maroons, Chinese, and Indigenous and tribal peoples. As described by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Suriname affirms that unity in diversity is actually possible to realize within societies. Suriname teaches solidarity within the school system. Children and young people are encouraged to celebrate each other's cultural holidays by singing songs, wearing traditional costumes, and sharing food. And this education in mutual respect provides a foundation for the peaceful coexistence that lies at the core of Suriname's culture. The focus on solidarity education is a lesson for countries around the world that are confronting ingrained patterns of violent cultural polarization. The key challenge is the full social inclusion of the Indigenous peoples living in remote areas. Now, my country visit to Denmark and Greenland in May 2025 was also inspiring. As the Danish Youth Council engages in solidarity actions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the Youth Delegate Program's uniqueness, it's by youth, for youth, and it empowers the voice of young people. Another innovative actor in international solidarity is the Investment Fund for Developing Countries. It provides a model for international solidarity for sustainable development through its investment projects, and it follows a human rights matrix at the pre-investment stage to assess due diligence obligations and risks in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe. The Inuit Circumpolar Council promotes solidarity as a norm. Nothing about us without us. Always engage with the Inuits. So finally, I suggested the creation of a Truth Commission to help provide for a common understanding between the people of Denmark and the Greenlandic and Inuit people in order to create greater social cohesion. So I invite you all to the side event tomorrow at 1 to celebrate 20 years of solidarity. We will serve empanadas. You are all welcome. Thank you.